just say welcome everybody. Welcome to the 6x6 social. I don't know if this is about the 14th one we've done now. And we're back onto Desert Island Discs with Steve McCoy, who is going to be talking to Colin McPherson. Colin.
Thank you very much, Craig. Yes, Desert Island Pics it is, of course. And we're going to start with a question for you. It's not a very difficult quiz question, but I'll pose it anyway. So what links housing estates, fun fairs, cribs, shopping trolleys, Skelmersdale, demolition sites, and the Liverpool to Preston coastline? The answer, as we all know, is Stephen McCoy, a man who has published books through Cafe Royal Books on all those subjects. And if you haven't seen any of them, well worth getting hold of. Tonight's Desert Island Pics is Stephen McCoy, one half of the McCoy-Wynne partnership, very, very successful commercial photographers, but also artists in their own individual right, but also as a partnership. And of course, we've talked at 6x6 and shown triangulation, which we've really enjoyed. Stephen is from Liverpool, and he is one of the authentic voices of 6x6, not like the interlopers who've come from further afield. So I'm really excited to hear what Stephen's Desert Island Pics are. And I think we're just going to go straight on and ask Stephen and say hi there and tell us, hello, what is your first Desert Island pic?
Okay, I'm just going to share the screen, see whether we can see that. Okay, so first of all, just a bit of a preamble, if you don't mind, for a couple of minutes. I guess, like a lot of previous presenters for Desert Island Pics, this has been very, very difficult. The task has been almost impossible to try and choose 5 photographs that, you know, represent certain points in my career and I feel as though have influenced me as a photographer. I guess it would have been easier to choose photographs that I wouldn't take to a desert island, to be honest with you. And I can run through a list later, but I better not do that in a public forum. But my strategy was to choose work by photographers that, first of all, were significant to my own development as a photographer at a particular time. Photographs that I like to look at, and also photographs that perhaps we could use to raise points for discussion. Before I show the first slide, just talk a little bit about my thoughts on photography, not for too long. But for me, basically, photography really has no status at all. It's a tool, basically. I feel it can be used very much like perhaps a paintbrush could be used, you know, to paint a front door or even to create a masterpiece. I also think that photography is quite a difficult juggling act. You've got to balance very many concerns, some of which are intellectual. The intellectual content or the idea is very important. The choice, the subject matter is also important. And then obviously the technical treatment of it, especially the structure or the composition of the image. I think of myself as, I suppose, a formalist in the broadest sense of the word. And that means for me that the composition tends to be paramount. I also like to kind of explore how the photographs can be formed and experiment with different ways of making pictures. Somebody asked me how I would classify myself, and I suppose maybe as a conceptual documentary photographer. It doesn't sound too pretentious. I'm not really interested in narrative or story making particularly. I'm interested in making pictures and the effects of light and time, and also in photography itself, the ways in which photographers make images. And I suppose the bottom line of why I make pictures is that I photograph what I'm interested in, and I need to be sure that photography is the best medium for doing this, as maybe opposed to film or literature. And I photograph what I like to look at. So I guess after that kind of like preamble, let's move on to the first slide. So this is a photograph taken by my dad Charles McCoy, and it's me in the blue duffel coat and red Wellingtons, which, you know, I'd like to say I've still got somewhere and use for, you know, taking photographs on location, but unfortunately don't. My dad had many hobbies, photography being one of them, and he was able to kind of indulge his hobbies, as most men were, and still able to do, I guess. I can't recall my mum having a hobby. Homemaking and bringing up children took up most of the time. But I wanted to use this photograph not only because for me it's a very evocative photograph. Me and my mum outside our house with the dad's van, just visible. And it does provide a sense of time and place and a preservation of a moment. And I feel it's a strong photograph. The subject of the family has been photographed by many, many photographers, and family has always been very important to me. And I've photographed members of my family a lot. I feel there's also an element of melancholy, perhaps with all photographs, but especially those of the family. They remind us of moments that maybe are gone, never to be revisited. But I also chose this photograph to highlight the difference between amateur and professional photography. It's worth considering for a moment, because I think we can all agree that a definition of a professional photographer is one who earns money and a living through taking pictures, probably from commissions. An amateur photographer is one who spends money on photography. An amateur is one who takes photographs for pleasure, primarily, the joy of making pictures. And they tend to work in a very free way without constraints of a commercial brief, although maybe obviously other constraints of, you know, time and money. I earned a living for over 25 years from teaching photography. And during that time, I worked on several projects. Colin just mentioned a few earlier. So in one sense, I was an amateur photographer, earning a living from one activity and spending money on another. But being an amateur doesn't imply poor standards, to my mind. Many hobbyists have great levels of skill. But I feel the sense of being an amateur and having a freedom to work on personal projects and working just for the pure enjoyment of making photographs without thoughts of fame and fortune is very important. So the kind of one of the balancing acts that needs to take place, I think, is that professional standards need to be maintained, but with personal work, it helps to have a kind of amateur outlook.
I mean, I love this picture for many reasons. I mean, the colour is one thing that immediately strikes you, the composition, but also, which I think we'll come on to a bit later when we see your other choices, is that this is very much a moment. And that's something that I don't often associate with your photography, because as you say, you know, you kind of reject ideas of storytelling and narrative. But this has got a sort of sense of place. It has a sense of, but it does have a strong story, and I feel a strong narrative in it. And that's why, for me, it's a very interesting choice that maybe kind of goes beyond your professional or even amateur practice and taps into something a bit deeper. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, in one sense, that there is a story taking place there. You can see that mum's cleaning the snow from the front doorstep, and there's me looking at the camera, my dad's van, there's figures in the background. So in one sense, there is a story taking place there, isn't there? You know, and link that through with the kind of, you know, the associations of memory. I can just about remember that snowfall that day, you know, just about, and feeling cold. You know, so there's those elements to it, and I think those kind of those personal connections are very important in a lot of photography, aren't they? Whether through by, you know, association, or through maybe, you know, other kind of like links through to knowing the work, or knowing the photographer, or knowing the area. I think they can always add depth to any kind of appreciation of a photograph.
And I think it also taps into I mean, you sort of used the word, I think, earlier, sort of nostalgia, when, you know, when we were growing up and how summers were endlessly long and sunny, and winters were, you know, snow-filled and full of sort of fun and snowmen. And in a sense, this kind of backs it up, doesn't it?
Yeah,
I
it does.
if your father, as you mentioned, was a very keen photographer, so presumably, you know, there are hundreds or thousands of pictures that you could have chosen from the family archive.
Yeah,
this one, to me, seems very.
It does, and there's you know, there's not many photographs that can't be improved by a fall of snow, is there?
Well, that's very true, because that sort of leads, I think it will lead on to sort of the other pictures we'll look at, which is a lot to do with form, but also to do with light.
Yeah.
And it's always amazing how just snow illuminates any scene, and it sort of enhances other areas of the picture, which probably on a non-snowy scene would have looked rather drab and dull. You know, you think of those incredible sort of rich colour of the window panes, the windowsills.
Yeah, because I've kind of, like, a couple of years ago, I started another project, which is only half form, really, because the project was to photograph my mum outside every house she lived in.
Oh, wow.
And I've never really, I've taken all the photographs, but I'm struggling to deal with how it's going to be seen, because obviously, you know, mum and dad, this was actually my grandfather's house in Holsbury Road in Kensington. My mum and dad moved in when my grandfather died, terraced house. And my dad was a refrigeration engineer and sort of worked his way up through the company. And every time he got promoted, they moved to a different branch. So they moved around the country. But each time they moved, there was a kind of improvement in housing. So it's kind of like, it's an interest, and trying to get my mum to try and remember how much she paid for each house in turn, and the progression through that until we moved to Ainsdale, and my dad built his own house in Ainsdale. You know, it's kind of like that immediacy and that personal connection, but trying to find a form for the, you know, the photographs, really. But that's an aside.
Yeah, interesting. What, just as another aside, what camera did he use?
Well, actually, my dad had a Leica, believe it or not. He bought it from a police sale, an auction sale, because apparently when police, you know, kind of, might find, you know, a sort of a stash of stuff recovered from a burglary, and they couldn't find the owner, every so often they'd have an auction, and my dad actually bought an old Leica from this police auction that he used. Where it went after that, I've no idea, because it didn't remain in the family. Yeah. But yeah, you know, it's one of these things that I kind of alluded to the fact that, you know, he had lots of hobbies, you know, and whether that was particular to him or whether that was just part of his generation, but you know, marquetry, photography, you know, all kinds of things. You know, he was able to follow his interests.
And I think it's obvious, without being sort of patronising in any way to you, I think it's fairly obvious where your sense of form and composition, you've obviously somehow imbued that from your dad, because I mean that's a very, very strong element of your photography, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, he was blind in one eye as well, so that might have helped.
Okay.
Anyway, so next photograph. So the next choice, Edward Weston. And this is obviously, as you can see from the title, Dunes Oceano, 1936, relatively late on in his career, really. You know, for those, I mean, I chose Weston over two other alternatives, really. It could have been Ansel Adams or Walker Evans, but Weston was probably one of the first American modernist photographers to be highly regarded. He kind of moved away from his soft-focused pictorial portraiture to a more kind of hard sort of edged objectivity. And in parallel with the new objectivity movement in Germany in the 1920s, which was gaining importance, and that was typified by a German photographer that some of you may know, Albert Renger-Patch, forgive the pronunciation. And he was another close kind of contender for this talk. But during my last year at Manchester Poly, I bought a second-hand MPP 5.4 camera, after becoming increasingly interested in the work of Weston, Adams and Walker Evans. And I was more aware of the craft of photography and using the zone system of exposure and development to obtain, the best possible quality. Even though I was plagued a little bit by kind of uneven development in the early days. But I read Weston's day books, and if anybody hasn't read them, they're well worth a read, really. Diaries, basically, that he kept for about 15 years, starting in 1923, that went on to about 1938. Apparently, he destroyed some of his earlier records. And what kind of struck me with these was the kind of the romance of photography portrayed by Weston through the day books and through his work and through his life, really. And he writes a great deal about his life, getting up in the pre-dawn silence to write, his 2-year sojourn in Mexico, having affairs with several women, including Tina Modotti, his constant struggle with money all his life. Apparently he had about $300 in his account when he died, and he was trying to sell photographs at $25 a piece. If we had a time machine, we could probably go back and scoop a few there, for about $25,000 to $100,000 in the present day. There's many myths around Weston, and some he created, and many grew from rumour. And apparently there's re-evaluation had taken place by photo historians that have debunked some of these myths. But he definitely was into that kind of, bigging himself up as the kind of, creative person, the kind of struggling artist, trying to get his work more appreciated.
I think it's interesting touching on something you'd said at the beginning when you were talking in your introduction about the camera is basically just your sort of medium for expression, and that, maybe in another life it might have been a paintbrush or a pen. And I've got a quote from Weston. I think it's quite interesting in this context because he says, "I'm not a technician and have no interest in technique for its own sake. If my technique is adequate to present my seeing, then I need nothing more."
Yeah. I mean, that's true. It's kind of one of those things that, in one sense, he was quite direct in the way he worked. Apparently, he very rarely used a light meter, for instance. He felt the light, to use his expression. Even though he took, quite a few light meter readings of the surroundings, he didn't rely on that to make a correct exposure. Obviously, people are probably aware that he was a member of the short-lived F-64 group, which promoted qualities that were unique to the photographic medium, the clarity and sharpness from front to back of the subject. And I've chosen this picture, which I guess because it relates to some of the stuff that I was kind of concerned with at the time. I wasn't really interested in his Nautilus shells or his green peppers, and some of his nudes are a bit sort of, difficult to look at in the present day. He contact printed basically all of his work, so he shot on 10-8 and he tended to contact print in a very kind of direct way. And at the time I was starting out, I really appreciated, his work. But now you look back at it, as I was saying earlier to Colin and Craig, it's kind of like like a re-evaluation takes place, I think. You look back at work that maybe you appreciated when you were younger. You think, was it really that good? And maybe it's a sign of the times, or maybe because you kind of feel as though you've improved as a photographer that you can re-evaluate things, I also chose Weston to highlight another aspect of photographers and creative people, and I kind of call this the drive of the enhanced ego, really. I don't know whether ego is exactly the right term to use, but this idea of self-importance. And I think one needs ego as a creative person. You need to think, you need to believe in yourself, really. You need to think that what you're doing is worth something, that other people may be interested in what you're doing. And I think Weston had a very highly developed sense of his own self-importance. And he very much was interested in sort of creating his own myth through his writing in his day books. As I said earlier, he promoted himself as a very great underappreciated artist. And for me, you need ego to make work, but the best work, I think, comes from photographers who subjugate their ego in the face of the subject. And that's another kind of delicate balancing act, I think, is that you need ego to produce work. But, you know, for me, photographers need to kind of like not allow their ego to dominate the subject.
I think this is actually a great example of that, because there is something majestic and grand about a lot of Weston's work, and that you could imagine that he maybe had some sort of very overbearing ego to make it, but I don't think he did.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's one of those things that I think when he was working, he did feel perhaps small in his subject. How could you not when you're faced with dunes in Oceania and things like that? And obviously, this photograph related to a lot of the work I was doing along the coast. I mean, certainly the sand dunes in Ainsdale were never as big as this, but that kind of like the sense of light, texture, shape, form, very, very important to his work. And if you look at an awful lot of his work, that comes across. Everything he did was about shape and form and texture. Yeah,
and obviously that he worked a lot on the west coast of America. That's where he was based for most of his adult life. So the light is something that I think is apparent in everything.
Yeah. We used to joke. A couple of friends of ours, mine, we used to go photographing sort of Formby Pinewood. We used to joke and laugh and say, "This is our Point Lobos." Formby Point is our Point Lobos.
Well,
never found a dead pelican though.
That's true. Half close your eyes and you could be there.
Yeah, but there's a kind of like there's kind of re-evaluation of his work, and a lot of people say that his work is kind of obsessed almost with death. And a lot of his he did photograph a lot of dead things. I remember there was a photograph that he photographed on his very first Guggenheim Fellowship trip across America of a dead drifter, and he photographed dead pelican. That type of thing. There's that sense of sort of morbidity in his work.
Interesting. Very good. Next one, please. Yes. What's your third one?
Okay, here we go. Lee Friedlander. This is from a project that was done in 2010, America by Car. I don't know. What can I say about Lee Friedlander, really? In one sense, I'm not sure he would like anybody to say anything much about his work, because he himself is very reticent about talking. I find his work so interesting. I was actually tempted at one point to choose all 5 of these photographs from his vast body of work. Very media shy, and although he's actually in his 80s now and semi-housebound, he still works. He kind of deals with the visual language. So I guess, why does he feel the need to bolster his work with words? I think probably many photographers could learn from this, But he's been so prolific, taking photographs nearly every day, and his subjects are many and varied, from landscape, urban landscapes, portraits, self-portraits, family photographs, cars, streets, and nudes. There's one quote which I'll just read out here, which I think is quite interesting. There's a quote from Lee Friedlander here who says, "I only wanted Uncle Vern standing by his new car, a Hudson, on a clear day. I got him in the car. I also got a bit of Aunt Mary's laundry, and Bo Jack the dog peeing on a fence, and a row of potted tuberous begonias on the porch, and 78 trees, and 1,000,000 pebbles in the driveway, and more. It's a generous medium, photography." And I think that's very true, isn't it? When you take a photograph, there's all these details within that picture. And I think the task is to make all of those elements in the photograph contribute to it, which is part of structure and composition, I guess.
Yeah, I think if there's one photographer that we can learn the most from in terms of just illuminating the world through photography, I believe it's Lee Friedlander.
Yeah.
I think he brings the sort of strict documentary vibe and takes it into an almost cinematic, constructed cinematic situation.
Unless you think that cinema learned from him, of course.
That's possibly true. Yeah.
The other way around, you know, the kind of some of his kind of compositions and the way he worked. You know, you might think that filmmakers, a lot of filmmakers, came from stills photography anyway. You know,
They did,
you
yeah.
wonder whether, you know, people like Wim Wenders and people like that looked at Lee Friedlander and used his kind of vision to create their kind of moving images.
Most definitely. Why this one in particular? Because I suppose we are more familiar with his, you know, his most celebrated work came in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, again with that kind of very West Coast vibe. But this is modern, contemporary, and yet still has the
I guess that's why I chose it. I think we're all familiar with the kind of the street stuff he did, you know, New York and places like that, self-portraits, the zoo photographs, you know. But this struck me as being quite modern, really. 2010, okay, coming to the end perhaps of his active working life. And the idea of basically visiting, I think he visited nearly 50 American states, driving rental cars and taking photographs as he went, or as he stopped, obviously, you know. And this one's actually taken in Montana. So, I mean, it just obviously the visual framework is there, isn't it? The kind of, you know, the doors, the mirrors, the kind of the Lee Friedlander motifs really breaking up that image surface, the reflections in the car mirror, etc., etc. They're all there. But I just think that kind of formal device of having a steering wheel and parts of the interior of the car, you know, again, going back to that kind of idea of, you know, formalism, and you look at a lot of Lee Friedlander's work, and it is very, very structured, very, very carefully composed in many ways. I don't think I can. I wouldn't describe him. I wouldn't describe him. Some people describe him as a genius, but I struggle with that term really. I can't think of many photographers who I would, you know, class as a genius. But I think he's one of the most talented of photographers. And if you ask me to describe talent, I'd probably say that it's being able to work hard enough for long enough on something. You know, just a sort of personal aside, I can remember being told by Martin Parr years ago about Chris Killip's working method, and he was another strong contender, Chris Killip, not Martin Parr, for this talk. And he basically said how Killip used to go out every single day and photograph until noon, go back to the darkroom in the afternoon, process his finds, fallen eggs, and make contacts in the evening. And he did this day in and day out. And that to me is talent. Being able to do that and sustain that over years and years, that idea of longevity and being able to work on things for a long time, I think is very important.
I think I was going to make the comment there. I was going to pose the question. I don't know whether there is an answer to it, because, as you said, Lee Friedlander is a very private person. But what continues to motivate somebody to take photographs? I mean, long after, you could argue, his best days are behind him. I wonder what really motivates him to keep going like this, because this is classic Friedlander.
I think it just goes back to joy in seeing, doesn't it? It just goes back to the delight and the joy in looking at things and making records of that joy and delight, and using the mechanisms of photography, the kind of the composition and the sharpness and all those things to actually somehow record that delight in seeing, and that to me is so important. If you lose that joy in seeing, then you move on to something else.
And also what I love about his images, I mean, there's that spontaneity, although it's brilliantly constructed, but there's the spontaneity and there's humor. There's always humor.
Absolutely. It's like, Stephanie mentioned, I think, in her talk too, about Desert Island Pics. It's wit, isn't it? Just absolutely love wit. Photography who's got wit, not over the top humor, but that kind of that wit that deals with, that comes from maybe the knowledge, that deep knowledge of photography, what photography can and can't do, what it's good at doing and what it isn't doing. And, playing around with those kind of the visual kind of, compositional elements in a photograph, those juxtapositions of things, so important.
Fabulous.
If you were to look at Lee Friedlander, I think if we draw parallels with writing or poetry or music, he's experimenting all the time with the syntax of the image. Is it iambic pentameter, or is it, you know, rhyming couplets? So in that simplistic sort of way of looking at things. But I really like the work of photographers that do experiment with the form of the photograph. And some photographers find their kind of voice or style early on and never change. But for me, creativity comes from pushing the envelope and trying things out. To quote Bob Dylan, dare I,
You dare.
An artist should be in a continual state of becoming.
Very good. Which leads us nicely on to your next selection, I think.
So Lewis Boltz is the next photographer. The photograph I've chosen is from one of his early projects. It was New Industrial Parks. You can see from the title, very precisely titled, and you find that with almost all Boltz's work, is that the title describes exactly where he took it. He's almost inviting you, if you could, to go to that place and view the photograph and just verify for yourself that it was a truthful record. It does represent a very important movement, which, funnily enough, even though it was like first exhibited in 1975, is still called New Topographics, which maybe should be called Old Topographics. It was actually called New Topographics, Photographs of the Man-Altered Landscape. But I guess in these modern times, that gender-specific thing should be changed to perhaps People-Altered Landscape. It was originally a very small exhibition in 1975 in George Eastman House. And there was about 10 photographers, I think. Obviously, Lewis Boltz, Robert Adams, Stephen Shaw, Bernard Hiller Becker, Nicholas Nixon, Joe Deal, Frank Golk, John Schott, and Henry Westland Jr. You know, very important photographers. Perhaps not as well known when the exhibition first happened in 1975, but it certainly enhanced their reputation. I was kind of in a dilemma whether to choose Lewis Boltz or maybe Robert Adams or perhaps Stephen Shaw. But I chose Boltz because I actually went to a workshop with him in 1980, week-long workshop at Paul Hill's photographer's place. If anybody knows Paul Hill, he used to run workshops from his kind of farm for a great many years. And lots of really good photographers went there to run workshops. And his kind of work, Lewis Boltz's work, moves away from the kind of unspoiled Garden of Eden photographs that you might think of as, you know, produced by Weston and Ansel Adams and people like that. And Boltz's images really describe the architecture of the human landscape, the offices, the factories, the parking lots, housing developments. And he also wrote very perceptively about photography. If you ever get the chance to read some of his essays, they're well worth reading. A quick, sort of short quote, I should say, not a quick quote, a short quote. He wrote, "The tension implicit in any photograph is the tension between an inert black and white two-dimensional object. An event actually existed in the phenomenal world. A successful photograph mediates, though never completely resolves that tension." And he also felt that photography occupied a very unique position between film and the novel. And I think this photograph also deals with the idea of photography being able to elevate the trivial through careful composition, through careful looking. You know, all you've got there is, you know, a construction site, a detail of a factory wall, perhaps under construction, but the way he's composed in a very formal manner, you know, making kind of lines, shapes, blocks, constructing that photograph through careful framing is pretty important.
I mean, there's something even in black and white absolutely painterly about it in its form.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to kind of, you know, I don't know, some of the kind of semi-abstract painting.
Yeah.
You know, looking at that. But again, I don't know why photography should be, you know, related to painting. I mean, it's, you know, uniquely photographic. I don't think you could achieve that kind of image through any other medium, really. I mean, I kind of like put his work in as well because I'd like to discuss the notion of typology, really.
Yeah.
And it's very rare, I think, for me anyway, that a single photograph can have the same power or create a sense of awe that a single painting can. I mean, Stephanie mentioned in her talk the work of Gursky. He may be an exception, I'm not sure. But photographs describing the same subject and arranged into sets can produce a cumulative effect. And I think that's why a lot of photographers choose to work in that way. You know, they can more fully describe a subject through, you know, several photographs rather than just one photograph.
And that was, I mean, that was very much a function of the new topographics, especially the exhibition that you were alluding to, is that I think each photographer presented 10 pictures. I mean, they were on various sizes, but they tended not to be big pictures.
Oh, very, very small.
Really
Very
to do
small.
with sort of grid thing, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And Lewis Bolt's virtually all of his work has been exhibited as grids. So there's no hierarchy. There's no more important photograph than another. They're all the same size. There they are. They're meant to, you know, support each other and be seen almost as like one work, I guess, you know. I remember David Hockney saying it a while ago, because David Hockney dabbled in photography. He said that he felt photography was a very small medium, partly because there's no sense of time in a photograph. And if you think of painting, think of some of maybe the pre-Raphaelite painters. I read somewhere that, you know, they take up to a day to paint a square inch of canvas. And when you look at their paintings, you can appreciate that sense of devotion and time to that kind of, you know, way of working. But this, I guess, this lack of sense of time can be circumvented by producing sets of photographs, which is why I think a lot of photographers work in that way.
Well, and it also comes then to the sort of populating exhibition spaces, and we'll move on to another aspect of outcomes, if you like, for photography. But you know, that I know you've exhibited in quite a few places, and you think quite deliberately and carefully about the space. I mean, all photographers do, but I think maybe your approach to it is very much based on your influences from the new topographics, I would suggest.
Yeah, it tends to be. I mean, I do, if I'm working on a set of photographs, there doesn't tend to be a hierarchy. I see all photographs as being equal, you know. And I think, you know, the idea of exhibiting, I mean, basically, I was very active during the 80s, I guess. But in 1990, I stopped exhibiting. I had my last exhibition, the Blue Coat Chambers. And I thought, what is the point of doing this? You know, the kind of like the effort involved wasn't outweighed by, you know, the outcomes. So I stopped exhibiting for about 17 years until Stephanie and I had an exhibition together. It was called Quiescence, and the work from that went on to be featured as finalists in the Liverpool Art Prize. So 17 years, I didn't exhibit anything. I carried on working. I was taking photographs, but
I mean, there's a sort of
exhibiting is a very problematic thing, I think.
Well, there's a parallel there, because the exhibition, the new topographics, I mean, it's had one showing, I think, in the United Kingdom way back when Paul Graham and James Southern took it to Bristol. Yeah. I think that was the best part of 30, maybe 35 years ago. I mean, it's done, but it's interesting because its reach and its influence, and the reach and influence of those photographers has been absolutely astonishing.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible when you think about it. You know, that one small exhibition, you know, absolutely the kind of influence of those, not just the exhibition, but I guess it's the photographers themselves who then went on, use that as a springboard to go on and produce work. You know, it's incredible really that so many photographers reference that, you know, and you think, 1975, come on, you know.
It's absolutely astonishing, but like you say, you know, I think I see a lot of parallels in your work, and I suppose that is the legacy. So it's amazing. Absolutely. So show us your final photograph.
The final photograph is Stephen Gill. This is from a set of work called The Pillar. So it really kind of like chimes with my appreciation of experimentation with the form of photography and work that is concept driven, really. This is shown by Stephen Gill's not just this set of work, but by many of his other projects. And this is from 2019, and there's a reprint of the book that's just come out this year. And basically, he set up a wildlife camera that was triggered by the movements of the birds themselves. And it follows on from his previous book that was called Night Procession. So Stephen Gill is a relatively young photographer. He's born in 1971, born in the UK, moved to Sweden about 4 years ago. And a lot of his work deals with the idea of observation and collection, because he was influenced by, I think, his father, who was a photographer and a naturalist. So it's almost like a kind of re-evaluation of nature photography in many ways. So he kind of like, he had a growing interest in birds and insects, and the initial kind of obsession with collecting bits of pond life to inspect under his microscope. He set up his own book publishing company called Nobody Books, so he could control the quality and design of the printing. And I remember Field Studies, one of his first books that contained several of his projects, including the backs of billboards, people who were lost, people with shopping carts, and roadworks. And he very much bridges the gap between documentary photography and conceptual art. You know, another little sort of short quote, he talks about this work and says, "In a way, the birds made the work themselves. I've just orchestrated an environment in which the pictures can be seen." So in the context of my previous comments, maybe relating to Edward Weston, the idea of, you know, a kind of the artist photographer, you know, looking through the camera and, you know, all the rest of it, and ego. I find this work very interesting because the photographer as an author has disappeared, and the subjects have taken their own photographs. The photographer's obviously reappeared as a curator, but the idea of the photographer's refined vision has been reduced. And again, the delight for me from these photographs is just the visual forms that the birds make as they land on this pillar, or even on the camera itself. And you obviously mentioned before about exhibitions and books, and I think Stephen Gill probably is more interested in publishing work than exhibiting, although obviously the two things go hand in hand. If you have an exhibition, you can sell a book. You know, people can see the work and then they would perhaps buy the book. But he thinks the book form perhaps is the more lasting legacy of any particular set of work.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with him. It's rather than the exhibition selling the book, it's the book selling the exhibition, really. The books come first. That's the driver with him. And they are remarkable. That's some remarkable books. It's incredible. There's a sort of obvious question, I suppose, when we look at your choices, that other than the photograph made by your father, it's all black and white.
Yeah, it's one of those things I did consider. I think, because obviously I've worked a lot in colour, started off in black and white. But I think the idea of form and shape, which is very important, is obviously perhaps more easily displayed in black and white photography than it is in colour. Colour, there are many other different concerns. And so I wanted to kind of narrow the scope down a bit, rather than then introduce the, you know, kind of photographers who work in colour, because that's a kind of whole of the big area. So that's one reason why I kind of narrowed the choice down, really.
Yeah, I mean, black and white has the enduring appeal. And the interesting thing is that you see, although they're all four pictures, excluding the colour one at the beginning, the four black and white, they're very different pictures, but there's something that kind of unites them all. I find them quite logical. If I was to see them together, I would see there's a logic, but I suppose that's you and your character, if you like.
Are you saying I'm logical, Colin? Is that a compliment?
That's one of many compliments I pay you, Stephen. Thank you very much for sharing those pictures that you take to Desert Island. As you know, you're allowed the collected works of Shakespeare and the Bible, which I know you'll take with you. But is there another book you'd like to take with you as well? So
yeah, so this is the book I'd take with me to Desert Island. The Summer Book by Tove Jansson. She's probably better known for the Moomintroll books, and and the kind of cartoons, but just that, you know, when you read about her life, such an incredible person. She did so much, not just the Moomin Trolls, which, you know, started off as a bit of a cartoon and then became a worldwide franchise. But I discovered the Moomin Troll books when I was a teenager. And although you might consider them as being kids' books, which is basically what they are, there's a lot of wisdom in them. But she wrote an awful lot of books and short stories for adults. And this summer book, very, very small book, but I find that every single kind of like page is just so beautifully written and so evocative of the landscape. And this book in particular deals with the relationship between a grandchild and granddaughter on a small island. And Tove Jansson used to go every summer to an island, and they go for Finland and spend the whole summer just working, painting, thinking, writing. And this book I just find just absolutely, it's perfect. And each story is almost like a prose poem, if that makes sense, you know. And I just think that it's just really good.
And it sounds like, as it's set on an island, it's the ideal book to read on an island.
Exactly. Yeah. What better? Yeah.
Excellent. And then, of course, we give you only one luxury item to take with you to your mythical island, whether it's in the Gulf of Finland or somewhere a bit warmer. What is your luxury item?
Well, I think I'd have to take an iPhone, perhaps with the SIM card taken out so I couldn't ring international rescue, so that I could just take photographs of my time on the island and document the things I see on the island. So that would be my luxury item. It's probably the one camera I tend to use more than any other.
Would you be setting that on black and white or colour?
It doesn't matter with an iPhone. You can take them in colour and convert them to black and white. So it doesn't matter.
Nicely sidestepped. Stephen, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to those selections and your insights.